Within the vast collection of eerie and terrifying urban legends circulated worldwide, there is one particularly prominent tale that almost anyone interested in the horror genre has encountered: the Russian sleep experiment. This is not merely a simple legend, but has become a social media phenomenon, widely shared through articles, storytelling videos, and even in works inspired by it. If you are a fan of frightening stories, there is a very high chance you have heard of this terrifying experiment at least once. The story begins with a setting supposedly taking place in the 1940s, a time when the world was engulfed in war. According to the legend, Soviet researchers at that time conducted a bizarre and haunting psychophysiological experiment, keeping humans awake for 15 consecutive days. The goal of the experiment was to explore the physical and mental limits of humans when deprived of sleep for an extended period. To achieve this, they used a special odorless gas, believed to have the ability to suppress the human need for sleep. Participating in the experiment were 5 political prisoners detained for their involvement in World War II. These individuals were promised freedom if they completed the full 15 days under the experimental conditions. They were locked in a completely sealed room with a continuously operating oxygen and gas supply system. All other basic needs, such as food, water, toilets, books, etc., were ensured, creating a seemingly ideal environment for monitoring psychological reactions. However, the terrifying aspect did not lie in the scientific side of the experiment, but in what happened in that room over the subsequent 15 days. Abnormal behaviors, panic, loss of control, and ultimately the nightmare of madness, all combined to create a story that simultaneously intrigued and chilled people. The Russian sleep experiment is not only haunting because of its objective, but also because of its organization and execution environment, a completely enclosed space where every element was strictly controlled for a single purpose: to prevent humans from sleeping. The 5 individuals chosen to participate were all political prisoners, detained during World War II. They were not considered ordinary people, but individuals with heavy pasts and complex psychological profiles. Their selection may have served 2 purposes, both as a form of punishment and as a way to avoid consequences for ordinary people if the experiment failed. They were placed in a completely sealed laboratory room with no way out. Despite being imprisoned, the prisoners were provided with all the necessary amenities for basic living: books to read, chairs to rest on, a water system, clean sanitation facilities, and enough dry rations to sustain them for many days. However, this seemingly complete living space was a perfect psychological trap. The most noteworthy aspect was the odorless gas system pumped into the room's air. This gas was maintained at a careful ratio, just enough to ensure the subjects' lives were not endangered, but effective in suppressing the need for sleep. Combined with a continuous supply of oxygen, the scientists created an environment where the body could function normally, but the mind was gradually pushed to the brink of losing control. The behavior of the individuals in the room was strictly monitored through a system of cameras and microphones. Every word, whisper, or smallest action was recorded. In the early days, the prisoners mainly talked to each other and appeared anxious, constantly asking if they would be released after the experiment ended. They seemed to still have hope for freedom and tried to maintain their spirits to overcome the challenge. However, this was only the beginning of an unprecedented nightmare in the history of psychological experiments. What happened afterward would gradually make everyone realize that there are things within humans that, when pushed to the limit, can never return to what they once were. After the first few days of conversation, appearing normal and hoping for release, the psychology of the experimental subjects began to show clear signs of change from the 4th day. Conversations gradually became gloomy, tinged with despair, and heavier. The topics no longer revolved around their current lives or plans after freedom, but shifted to painful memories of the past, about family, war, loss, and loneliness. By the 5th day, signs of psychological disorder began to appear clearly. The individuals no longer conversed with each other as before. Instead, they whispered continuously to themselves or to the microphone installed in the room, a device they had originally only used to request basic needs from the researchers. These whispers were in low and difficult-to-hear tones, as if they were talking to something or someone unseen. Instead of interacting with each other, they began to focus their gaze on the one-way mirror, where, on the other side, the scientists were monitoring the entire process. The feeling at this point was as if they had discovered something, a secret known only to them, or they believed that some force was observing them not from outside, but from within the room itself. This worried the researchers. Could the gas be causing hallucinations or altering the subject's perception? Physically, nothing was unusual. They were still alive, moving, and their oxygen absorption levels were stable. But psychologically, what was happening became increasingly inexplicable. The silence was not normal. It did not come from peace, but from a growing fear within each person. Increasingly, the research team realized something more terrible. The room was not simply a place to conduct an experiment, but was becoming a mental hell, where humans were stripped bare of moral and rational illusions. And what was even more frightening was that the people inside seemed not to want to escape. As they moved into the 9th day, the developments within the sealed room began to spiral out of the scientists' control. One of the 5 participants suddenly went insane. He screamed wildly, running around the room with all his might as if trying to escape something invisible. The panic attack lasted continuously for 3 hours, to the point where his final screams were just meaningless, guttural sounds, perhaps because his vocal cords had been severely damaged from excessive shouting. What stunned the scientists was not only the mental breakdown of this individual, but also the reaction of the others. Instead of showing fear or trying to help, they completely ignored him, continuing to whisper into the microphone as if nothing had happened. This indifference was no longer simply a loss of emotion, but seemed like a detachment from humanity, a clear sign that their minds were no longer functioning as human minds. When the second person began to scream, something strange happened. The scream suddenly stopped, and with it, all sound in the room completely vanished. From the microphone, no more voices, noises, or whispers could be heard. The room became suspiciously, even eerily, silent. The researchers could not understand what was happening. They continuously checked the microphone system, suspecting that the equipment had malfunctioned. However, the data showed that all 5 individuals were still alive. Their oxygen consumption levels were normal, even indicating that they were consuming more oxygen than usual, meaning their bodies were still active, still existing, but they were not making any sound. A sense of unease spread, because in such a completely sealed space, it was impossible for 5 living people to be completely silent if their minds were still intact. From that moment on, all logical rules began to break down. The scientists began to realize they were no longer in control of the experiment, and what they were observing was no longer human as it had been. Moving into the 10th day, everything became even more terrifying when the surveillance camera system in the room suddenly stopped working. All visual images from the laboratory room completely disappeared, leaving a cold and ambiguous void. The scientists, who relied on cameras to monitor behavior, now only had one means left to grasp the situation inside: the microphone and a small one-way glass window. However, since the absolute silence enveloped the room several days prior, the audio devices had also not picked up any sound. There were no whispers, no footsteps, and no more of the terrifying screams from before. Although the oxygen absorption levels indicated that the people in the room were still alive, the eerie stillness made everyone wonder: are they even human in there anymore? Fear spread among the research team. They began to suspect that the individuals had fallen into a vegetative state, or had even died without the system detecting it. Faced with the tense situation, the scientists were forced to come up with a final solution. It was to establish a direct communication system with the room to check if there were any signs of life. A simple message was sent inside: test the microphone system. Stay away from the door and lie on the floor. If you cooperate, you will be freed. A response finally came, but it stunned everyone. A calm, composed voice echoed back to the promise of freedom: we no longer want to be freed. That cold statement was a major shock to the entire research team and those involved in the experiment. No one could understand why the people inside would refuse the opportunity to escape. Something in that gas prevented them from, or made them unwilling to, leave. Their minds now seemed to have been completely altered, to the point where freedom was no longer a meaningful concept to them. And that was when the boundaries between human and monster began to blur. On the 15th day, with no other way to determine the actual condition inside the room, the scientists and the military decided to open the door. The system was activated. Oxygen was pumped in, and the mysterious gas, believed to keep the subjects awake, was gradually withdrawn. But instead of feeling relief, a terrible surprise occurred. As soon as the gas was removed, 3 voices cried out urgently, begging the researchers to pump the gas back in. They pleaded desperately, as if their lives depended on that toxic substance. Their attitude was no longer like normal people, but resembled that of addicts, willing to trade everything just to inhale that substance again. Despite being utterly bewildered, the soldiers entered the room as ordered. But what they saw inside stunned, even horrified, many of them. 4 individuals were still alive, but no one dared to be sure if they were still human. The dry rations were untouched, indicating that since the 5th day they had not eaten anything. Yet they were still alive. The corner of the room was the most haunting. The body of the 5th person was brutally dissected, with organs and flesh stuffed into the drains, apparently having torn his own abdomen open to death. The laboratory was in chaos, with water and blood flooding above ankle level. The 4 survivors were no better. Their chests and abdomens were flayed, exposing ribs and tendons. Some wounds were still bleeding fresh blood, indicating they were still self-mutilating. But strangely, their digestive and respiratory systems were still functioning normally, as if their bodies had adapted to the constant pain. The soldiers shuddered, unable to believe that the creatures before them had once been human. Some refused to return to the room a second time after what they had witnessed. The experiment had gone too far, and the line between science and disaster had officially been erased. After witnessing the horrific scene inside the room, the soldiers were ordered to use force to subdue the 4 surviving individuals and bring them out. But what shocked everyone was the subjects' frantic reaction. They screamed, thrashed, and resisted violently like cornered animals. The 4 individuals had completely lost their minds, acting on wild survival instincts. One bit a soldier's neck, another used his fingernails to tear at the faces of anyone who dared to approach. The aggression reached an extreme when one soldier had his testicles torn off, and another nearly lost a leg during the restraint process. Amid the chaotic scene, with blood everywhere, doctors and nurses tried every means to inject sedatives to calm the madness. But even after injecting a dose 10 times the normal amount, the effect was almost nil. These individuals continued to resist extraordinarily, as if their bodies had surpassed all biological limits. In the end, only 3 survivors were taken to the research area for further monitoring. But even in their bound and injured state, they continued to beg to breathe the gas. For them, the gas was no longer a sleep suppressant. It had become their only source of life. Was taken to the operating table. He no longer had vocal cords, likely from screaming excessively in the previous days. Although unable to speak when the doctor offered to let him inhale the gas again, he nodded repeatedly, clearly indicating his agreement. Even when asked if he wanted surgery without anesthesia, he immediately accepted. The surgery lasted 6 hours, and throughout that time, this person maintained a completely alert expression, even smiling whenever the nurse looked into his eyes. After the surgery, instead of resting, he continued to thrash about, demanding to be dissected further. This scene not only exceeded the limits of medicine, but also challenged every definition of humanity. What was happening was no longer an experiment. It was the awakening of something inhuman, stemming from a desperate hunger for that ghostly gas. Following the horrific 6-hour surgery, during which one subject remained awake despite not being anesthetized, the experiment continued with the second individual. Unlike the first, this person did not resist or say anything, only continuously laughed in a dull and lifeless manner, the laugh of someone who had completely lost their mind. The only alertness this person showed was when allowed to inhale the gas again. He immediately became focused, and his eyes became lively, as if only in that gas were they still themselves. The question arose, why did they crave the gas so much? When asked, the answer they gave was terrifying and haunting. I must remain awake. That sentence was not simply an answer. It was a confession, a declaration from beings who no longer lived in reality. For them, sleep was no longer a state of rest, but the beginning of annihilation. They feared sleep, feared what lurked deep within their minds, feared something more terrifying than the madness they were experiencing. The atmosphere in the research area began to become suffocating and frantic. Doctors, nurses, soldiers, and even the scientists, who had once firmly believed in control and reason, now no longer knew where the boundary between sanity and madness lay. All faith in science wavered. No one knew what was truly happening, or why these people had transformed so drastically. At the height of the chaos, the commander of the research station ordered the experiment to be terminated and the remaining 3 individuals to be killed. He believed this was the only way to stop the growing threat within their own facility. But before the order could be carried out, a medic snatched a gun and shot the commander dead on the spot. At that moment, the 3rd individual, the last survivor, let out a knowing smile. When the medic, now holding the gun, asked in panic, "What are you?" the subject replied without hesitation, "I am the remaining part inside your people. The hidden madness you always suppress, the fear in every sleep. The thing you try to forget, try to bury, but can never truly eliminate." After hearing the chilling answer from the last subject, who claimed to be the embodiment of the latent madness within the human mind, the medic holding the gun could no longer bear it. In a moment of compressed fear and rage, he pulled the trigger, firing a shot directly into the subject's chest. As the bullet pierced through the body and blood began to gush out, that creature, or rather that remnant of a human, only whispered one last sentence before taking his final breath. Almost. Free. And that is the haunting end of one of the most famous horror urban legends in the world, the Russian sleep experiment. But what about the truth? This story, despite being widely circulated online and believed by many to be true, is actually just a creepypasta, a form of horror fiction written for the purpose of scaring and entertaining. There is no historical evidence or scientific documentation confirming that such an experiment was ever conducted in the 1940s in Russia or anywhere else. The famous image associated with the story, a picture of a gaunt, emaciated creature with a distorted face and a seemingly dissected body, is also not a real person. It is a product of special effects in Photoshop, created to look like the corpse of a brutally experimented on human. The image of the room was also edited to appear cold and dark, creating an eerie feeling consistent with the story's content. Even the original model in the photo was actually an artist specializing in makeup for Halloween festivals, nicknamed Spaz. He did not harm anyone. He was simply someone who decorated props for horror events, but became a victim of social media when someone took his photo, edited it, and attached it to the terrifying story. Since then, he has been labeled as the creature of the Russian experiment, even though in reality he was just a makeup
trong những khoảng
artist.
từ năm 2005 đến 2008, và anh ấy chỉ là một nạn nhân của mạng xã hội khi mà có một thằng khốn nào đó mang anh ấy về nhà và chụp những tấm hình nhạy cảm, sau đó chỉnh sửa và đăng lên mạng cùng với một câu chuyện ghê rợn. Giờ đây, không những có vẻ bề ngoài quái dị, thì anh ấy còn nổi tiếng với câu chuyện cũng quái dị không kém.